Standing in front of a statue, motionless under the curious gaze of a few passers-by, his hand outstretched as if begging for alms from the stone figure. The scene was so absurd that it immediately drew attention. Some may have stopped in curiosity, others glanced at him briefly, and someone, unable to hold back their curiosity, stepped closer and asked why he was begging from a statue. Without hesitation, Diogenes replied, "I'm training myself to be rejected." Extreme gestures, shocking responses, and encounters bordering on the unbelievable. This is just one of the many stories we'll explore in this video about Diogenes of Sinope, known as the Cynic, the man who turned every moment of his life into an open challenge to society's rules. No one before him had dared so much, living with nothing, provoking philosophers and kings, breaking every convention with a razor-sharp irony that left everyone speechless. His stories sound like something out of a fable, yet they are real and can be found in Book 6 of Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, masterfully translated by Pamela Mensch and published in 2018. Diogenes was born around 412 BC in the city of Sinope, located on the shores of the Black Sea in what is now Turkey. His life, marked by extreme choices and philosophical provocations, came to an end in Athens in 323 BC. From a young age, he stood out for his rebellious spirit. A controversy involving his father, who was accused of counterfeiting coins, led him to leave his hometown. According to some accounts, this episode deeply shaped his critical view of wealth and social conventions. After moving to Athens, he came into contact with Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates and the founder of Cynicism. Fascinated by the pursuit of virtue through simplicity, he fully embraced this philosophy, taking it to the extreme. His entire existence became a living manifesto. He renounced all material possessions, lived on the streets of the city, and survived on whatever he found or received as alms. His dwelling became legendary in the ancient world. Not a house, but a large terracotta jar, similar to those used to store wine, oil, or grain. Contrary to popular belief, it was not a wooden barrel, but a pithos, a type of container typical of ancient Greece. Choosing to live in such a jar symbolized his rejection of unnecessary needs and his quest for a life free from material attachments. His life was a constant challenge to conventions. Walking through the streets of Athens with a lit lantern in broad daylight might have seemed like madness, but for him, it was a symbolic act. When a passerby asked him why he was doing such a strange thing, he simply replied, "I am looking for an honest man." This phrase encapsulated his deep distrust of a society that, in his view, was incapable of living by authentic principles. Every action he took aimed to expose hypocrisy and prove that happiness does not come from possessions, but from inner freedom. One of the most famous episodes is his encounter with Alexander the Great. The young king, intrigued by the philosopher's reputation, approached him as he sat enjoying the sun next to his jar. "Ask me for anything you desire, and I shall grant it," he said magnanimously. Without even lifting his gaze, Diogenes replied, "Step aside, you're blocking my sun." Even these few words reflected his philosophy. True freedom cannot be granted by anyone, not even the most powerful ruler in the world. Struck by the response, Alexander famously declared, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Diogenes' consistency between thought and action was his defining trait. He did not merely criticize wealth. He lived with the bare minimum. It is said that he always carried a wooden bowl for drinking, until one day he saw a child drinking with his hands. Without hesitation, he discarded his bowl, saying, "This child has shown me that I still have too many unnecessary things." A gesture that perfectly encapsulated his belief that happiness comes from freeing oneself from artificial needs. In line with this philosophy, he left no written works. He believed that wisdom should not be passed down through books, but through concrete example. Irony and provocation were his tools for challenging others' beliefs. One of his most famous confrontations was with Plato. After Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes showed up at the academy holding a plucked chicken and declared, "Here is Plato's man." This act forced Plato to refine his definition, adding that man is a featherless biped with broad nails to differentiate humans from animals. Episodes like this were not mere provocations, but attempts to bring philosophy back to the reality of everyday life. Diogenes also showed no deference toward the wealthy. According to one account, a rich man, proud of his luxurious home, invited him to visit. After looking around carefully, Diogenes spat on the floor and said, "I couldn't find a place dirty enough to spit." With this, he aimed to show that flaunting wealth was nothing more than a mask to conceal inner emptiness. His criticism spared no one, not even his own followers. Seeing some disciples boasting about living by his principles while still enjoying a relatively comfortable life, he told them, "Do you see that stone over there? If you strike it with a club, it neither complains nor moves. That is how a true philosopher should be." For him, the ability to endure life's hardships without being shaken by circumstances was the ultimate test of wisdom. Humor was one of his favorite weapons for exposing hypocrisy. During a banquet, the guests began throwing bones at him as if he were a dog. Without hesitation, Diogenes stood up and urinated on them, showing that those who treat others like animals cannot expect respect. He responded with the same bluntness to criticism of his everyday life. When someone reproached him for eating in the public square, he replied, "If eating is natural, it should not be done in secret, and if it is shameful, then it should not be done at all." His consistency was evident even in his most extreme actions. During Athens' scorching summers, he often walked naked through the streets, defying both the heat and the prejudices of his fellow citizens. For Diogenes, freedom was not just the absence of material constraints, but the ability to live by one's own principles, unaffected by the opinions of others. As Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher influenced by cynicism, once said, "What troubles men is not things themselves, but the judgments they hold about those things." Diogenes embodied this ideal in every action, showing that true wisdom lies in distinguishing what is essential from what is not. Even when faced with violence and injustice, he responded with words that struck deep. Seeing a man mistreat another, he said, "Why do you strike him? Do you not know that every man is a microcosm, a little universe?" A phrase that invites reflection on the intrinsic value of every human being. Diogenes left a lasting mark on Western philosophy. Before him, Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates and the founder of Cynicism, had already emphasized the importance of virtue, self-sufficiency, and detachment from material goods. But no one had ever taken these principles to the extreme with the same boldness, irreverence, and audacity as Diogenes. His example laid the foundation for Stoicism, which adopted many of the same ideas about virtue and mastering one's desires. The key difference was in how these ideas were communicated. While Stoics used a more measured and reflective tone, Diogenes wielded irony and provocation to challenge people's complacency. As Seneca wrote, "He is not poor who has little, but he who desires more," a concept that perfectly aligns with the philosophy of the thinker from Sinope. Could giving up what is unnecessary be the path to true inner happiness?